pub talk is entitled Fire Science, Oak versus Fir Habitats, presented by Alex Rahmlow of Oregon Department of Forestry. And he will explain how to manipulate fire behavior on your property and community by planning and treating hazardous fuels, as well as the pros and cons of oak and fir on the landscape. He is a fire planning coordinator with Oregon Department of Forestry, serving Lane County, and from the district office of Western Lane in Veneta. He applies for and administers grant funds aimed at reducing hazardous fuels while supporting long-term prevention and landscape resilience strategies. He has spent time as a wildland firefighter with ODF, Oregon Department of Forestry, and as an environmental scientist collecting field data for environmental impact statements. And his master's focus was at Texas A&M University, where he detailed the benefits and costs of urban forests. And he did his undergraduate at University of Wisconsin-Madison with a degree focused on forest conservation. And with that, let's give a warm welcome to Alex Rahmlow. Is he walking up? Thank you. Pass it over to you there.
All right. Okay, how are we doing tonight? Pretty good? Belly's full? Remains to be seen? Okay, all right. All right, so Alex Rahmlow with the Oregon Department of Forestry. Appreciate the Coast Fork for hosting this and inviting me to come speak with you guys tonight on fire behavior in both oak and fir. Can everyone hear me all right? Up a little louder? Is that better? Okay, all right, we'll try to speak up here. So, all right, we already went over these. Okay, so show of hands real quick. Who here can build a campfire? Seriously though, okay. All right, hands raised. If you have wet wood, you can still get a fire going. All right, we got a couple master fire builders here. Okay. Well, everyone that raised their hands on either one of those two questions understands this top triangle, which is fire behavior, right? So when you guys are trying to light your campfire, you're manipulating oxygen. So if it starts smoking, it may not get enough oxygen. If you have a big log, you may need more kindling underneath, tinder, stuff like that. So you guys all understand that top triangle. The focus of tonight is going to be on that bottom triangle, which is behavior. And really, fire behavior on the landscape is no different than fire behavior in a campfire ring. It's just on a larger scale. All right, so that's going to be the correlation we're trying to make here. Okay, so for example, can anyone tell me which direction they think the wind was blowing in this photograph? That way? Why do you say that way? Yep, so the sides of that hill are all black, right? So that's the prevailing wind direction. And the wind was fueling that fire, and where that fire was getting the most oxygen is where it did the most damage, which you can see in black there. You see on the other side of the black how it's green? So when wind blows over, you know, a mountain or a ridge, it goes over the ridge. It doesn't swoop right back down. And fire likes to run uphill, so, you know, it's got that going for it. Okay. Anyone tell me what's going on in this picture? You see those spots? Someone said something? It's a blotchy pattern. Does anyone have a guess as to what made those blotches? Fire, okay, all right, yeah, well, you got me. I did hear embers, all right, and so that's how fire moves in real time, right? So these embers can actually travel up to a mile away, and that's actually how fire will progress across a landscape, is throwing up these embers and starting new fires. It just jumps with the wind, right? So up to a mile away. I was working a fire down in southern Oregon. We had our fire camp. It was like 1,500 people. It was like a small mobile city. And we got back to fire camp, the safe spot, you know, at the end of the night, and I had charcoal that large on my tent. And I looked around, and every tent had charcoal that big too. So it was only a quarter mile away, but this stuff really does move, and when you get hot air, it can travel quite a ways. Okay. So when you guys are in your campfire and you're trying to make a good campfire, a lot of what you do is you manipulate the fuel, right? You put the tinder underneath the kindling and the log on top of both of those. In the forest, it's no different. So some of the technical, things that we look for is arrangement. So how are we arranging the fuel? Do we have horizontal continuity? Do we have vertical continuity? If it's very continuous fuel, it makes it easier for fire to spread. The less continuous it is, the harder the fire has to work to move to the next spot of combustible material. Does that make sense? All right. So, the top two pictures, left or right, which one do you think would risk having a canopy fire where the fire actually gets up into the canopy? All right, a lot of people said right, and you are right. You are correct, and it's because we have a lot more ladder fuels there, right? So there's a lot more connection from the ground up to the canopy. The other thing that we look at when we're assessing fire behavior is what type of fuel is out there, right? So we have really fine fuel that dries out really quickly, burns really fast, doesn't hold that much heat. So you can get a really fast-moving fire in fine fuels, for example, oak and prairie habitats. That moves fire very rapidly, basically at the rate of wind. So if you have a 5-mile-an-hour wind and all you're burning is fine fuels, you could have a 5-mile-an-hour rate of spread of that fire. The further right we go, the more energy it takes for that fire to actually get established. But once that fire does get established, it takes a lot more energy to control it. Does that make sense? All right. So, in the beginning of fire season, which type of fuel do you think is the highest risk, fine or coarse? Fine, right? Because it dries out the quickest. So it's going to be ready to combust earlier than the heavy stuff. All right, you guys are, yeah. You guys know this stuff, I think. I think we get it. Okay. So, surface and crown fires. When we talk about surface fire, we're basically talking about burning the understory. So the tree canopies are not really being impacted. When we talk about a crown fire, we're talking about fire in the canopy of trees. Generally, you have more severe fire if you have canopy fires, right? Because it takes a while to establish a canopy, right? And in order to get a canopy, you have to have a lot of residual heat. Party foul. No, I'm kidding. So, no, it was me. I was actually, okay. All right, so anyways, but this is a spectrum, all right? So you can have low severity, medium severity, high severity. You can have low severity in some spots, right next to high severity in other spots, right? Is this making sense so far? Are we still tracking? Okay, great. Okay. All right, so these are blanket statements, all right? So please don't pick this apart too in depth. This is really coarse-grained stuff. But in general, oaks have frequent fire in fine fuels. Typically, the fine fuel that's associated with oak are grasses. It's a prairie-type grass ecosystem, right? So one thing that happens with grass is it responds to relative humidity really rapidly, right? So grass in early summer will actually be ready to combust at the hottest part of the day and definitely not ready to combust at night when the relative humidity picks up. So the fuel moisture content in grass actually tracks the relative humidity in the air. And generally, relative humidity is lowest at the hottest part of the day and highest at the coldest part of the day or when the sun's not out. Dew point, okay. All right, so in general, oak and prairie have fine fuels. They burn relatively frequently because they spend more of their time in that combustion period where they're dried out. It requires much less energy to control a fine fuel than it does a heavy fuel. And when we say energy, we're really talking about water because that's how we fight these fires. You can have rapid movement because it doesn't take long for even green grass to dry out if you have a fire next to it. And it has a longer burn window. So that's why when I say burn window is how long is it spending in that period where it could combust, where a fire could start. And it has that longer window because it dries out quicker. So fine fuels, grasses will dry early in the morning and they'll stay dry until night. Maybe sometimes they'll carry over at night if you don't have good relative humidity recovery. Okay. All right, so we're getting into the weeds here a little bit, but conifer forests have more fuel, right? And because they have more fuel, control can be difficult, right? The more fuel, the more energy that is feeding that fire in fuel, the more energy is going to require to control that fire. It has a shorter burn window because the heavier, larger diameter material takes longer to dry out. So if you have a couple of dry days, grasses may dry out, but that larger diameter stuff is still pretty wet in the middle. That's why you cure your firewood for at least a year, right? Is you're trying to dry out that heavy material. Generally, conifer forests have higher moisture content. So if you ever walked out into a prairie or an opening in a forest and you walk into the forest, there's no wind. You walk out of the wind, you walk out of the forest, there's a whole bunch of wind. So the more airflow that you get through an area, the quicker an area will dry out, right? And so conifer forests generally have lower air mixing because they're just more shaded. The density is higher, so air doesn't move as freely through those systems. And air is really what can dry out systems pretty rapidly. All right. Okay. In terms of structure, this, again, blanket statements. But looking up here, does it look like these two species play nicely, or these two forest types play nicely? Do you see a lot of overlap? I don't see much overlap, right? So white oaks, they like to be spread really far apart, right? They like to have a large crown. Conifers don't mind growing close together, right? Conifers also grow faster than oaks. So if conifers don't mind getting crowded and they grow faster than oaks, which one do you think will win out? The conifers, right? And that's what you actually see around here quite a bit, and there's a reason we're seeing that. We're going to get into that in a second. All right. Okay, so some other things to point out. White oaks in the Willamette Valley, or oak and prairie systems in the Willamette Valley, they're fire dependent. And they're fire dependent because they need that disturbance to maintain their canopy. Oaks like to have sun in between one oak and another oak, right? They like 40 to 80 foot spacing. That's a lot of space. In an average oak woodland, you might have 30% of the sun actually reaches the ground. In a conifer forest, you can go in there and you get virtually no sun, right? So what white oaks depended on to maintain their structure was fire, because fire would wipe out these smaller conifers that would come in and seed an area. And if fire happened frequently enough, you would not get that many conifers that would get up into the canopy, because they'd burn every time a surface fire came through. Does that make sense? All right. Okay, so then moving over to conifers, they don't sustain drought that well, and that's actually what you're seeing out here in the forest a lot. So if you're seeing dead Doug fir, it's kind of a two-part thing, but they're getting really stressed with the lack of water in the last couple years. They're also growing in sites that aren't really ideal for them, and they're growing there because we removed a major disturbance, which is natural fire. So you're kind of seeing this ecology catch up to ill-suited species on certain sites. All right. Okay. So about 100 years ago, we as land managers decided it would be a good thing if we suppressed every fire we could, right? And it worked really well for about 100 years until we had a multi-year drought and a lightning storm that started more fires than we could put out before they got big. And one of the best examples of this was the Yellowstone fire back in 1988, I think it was. And so it burned over 800,000 acres, and the majority of what it burned, it was a canopy fire. Right, so it was a very intense fire that burned much more canopy than is historically accurate with that area. And the reason that happened is because we allowed that fuel to accumulate for 100 years while we were busy suppressing fire. It's a simple cause and effect there. To give you an idea of what 800,000 acres looks like, this is the protection district of Western Lane. So I-5 there on the right and the coast on the left, that's 750,000 acres. So that Yellowstone fire was larger than half the county. All right. So this is what fire suppression looks like in a historical oak habitat. On the left there, do you see all those green things? Yeah, all right. Well, so those are conifers, and my guess would be that they're anywhere from 15 to 20 years old. And those oaks, I bet, are 60 to 80 years old. Right? So conifers, I mean, they're pretty good at growing fast. And so that's what you're seeing there. And eventually what's going to happen is those conifers are going to get to the point where they start shading out the oak, but oak really don't tolerate shade well. So on some of your properties, you guys could probably go home and find this right now, all right? And you'll be able to tell if an oak is a relatively healthy, happy oak, or if it's a stressed out oak by the size of its canopy. If it has a 360-degree canopy with branches going low to the ground, it's probably a pretty happy oak. If you have an oak that has a couple spindly shoots that are kind of reaching up to the sky, chances are it's not a happy oak. And I would bet the reason it's not happy is it's getting crowded. So it's competing for sun, and it's competing for that resource, and it can't grow fast enough comparative to the other plants around it. So, all right. And just coming back to this, how are we doing here? Okay. So left, can you guys see those bottom pictures? Kind of, sort of? Okay. All right, on the left there, what do you see? Pretty open? Yep. Do you guys think that would hold a surface fire? A surface fire? On the ground? Absolutely, right? Oak leaves? Man, that is great. That stuff burns pretty quick. You think it would hold a canopy fire? No? Why not? There's too much space between the trees and from the canopy to the ground, right? So that's a pretty safe place to have a fire, actually, because you're going to have a surface fire, and it's going to be relatively easy to catch with water if you can get in there. What about the right? Different story, right? There's a lot of vegetation. There's plenty of ladder fuel, which is connecting the ground to the canopy. All right. So this study came out in 2017, and what they found was they did a whole bunch of, modeling and previous, I don't know what they did, but they're down there. Davis, Raymond et al. Google it, and you can read their abstract. But the take-home from their paper was, based on these bottom four components, we are going to see fire. The last couple years are going to be the new norm, and they found that because there's weather extremes, right? So relative humidity, if you haven't caught on yet, okay, here's a pun for you. That's a relatively important thing when it comes to fire, is relative humidity. And it's important because how much moisture is in the air is that you need to get rid of that moisture if you're really going to have good combustion, right? And the dead material that's on the ground is going to hold the same moisture as what's in the air. So if you have 80% humidity in the air, you're going to have 80% humidity in your fine fuels. Does that make sense? So when we spend 82 days without rain, there's a lot less moisture out there on the entire landscape. And when we have weather extremes where we have a week of 100 degrees, that really zaps what remaining moisture is out there. We have a high fuel load because we've been doing active fire suppression for 100 years. And that has its consequences. We have increased land use and recreation, so basically what they're getting at there is we have more starts on the landscape because we're getting more fire ignitions based on more people being out in the woods. And then we're seeing this increased wild and urban interface, and that gets at the impact of these fires. As more people that live in the forest, the higher that impact is going to be. All right. And we've been seeing that the past couple years, right? So that study came out in 2017. Last year we had that Paradise campfire. You guys remember hearing about that one? Yeah. So in blue there, you are seeing that fire's progression in 24 hours. So just to give you an idea of how fast that was 100 yards per second was how fast that fire was moving. That's covering a lot of ground. So what happened there is she was saying that it blew the cars up. And, generally what happens is a fire gets out of a forest and it stops being a forest fire. But because we had that much energy, when I'm saying that much energy, we had 65-mile-an-hour winds behind this thing. That's why this was such an intense fire, one of the reasons. And when you have that much energy behind a fire, houses can actually act like trees, right? So if you have one house that combusts, if it's in close proximity to another house, it becomes a domino effect, and the fire just moves through that stuff. We'll get to questions in just 1 second. So these are some of the factors affecting severity and rate of spread. 65-mile-an-hour winds, that means we had that much energy pushing this fire. We had a relative humidity of less than 20%. Does anyone know what the relative humidity here in Lane County is for us to start getting nervous as firefighters? I heard 40, that's close. Other way? 30, oh man, he nailed it. Under 30%, we start, we get a little edgy. We start kind of looking for that fire, and we hope that we're going to catch it small. 20% is very low. That's a very low relative humidity. We had 3% of the average rainfall, so the live vegetation that was out there did not have the adequate energy to combat a fire that was moving through the area. And we had steep slopes. What happens when you have a fire at the bottom of a slope is the heat that rises preheats all the fuel that's above it. So it's no different than if you put a log on the side of your campfire. You're preheating that log. You're drying it out. When a fire's at the bottom of the slope and goes up, that's exactly what's happening, is it's drying out that fuel as it's racing up that hill. All right. So this is pretty much worst case scenario, right? To have all 4 of those indicators line up like that is pretty rare. And the point that I want to get across with this is not that this is going to happen here. It's that we spend time in those types of conditions once or twice a year. So here in Lane County, when I talk about do you guys know what I mean when I say fire window? So the fire window is essentially how long do we spend in a time frame where we could have severe fire. So California's fire window is a lot larger than our window, right? Because they spend 3 months in extreme fire danger, which is a long time, and that's why they have a lot more extreme fire events, because they're spending longer in that probability of we could have an extreme fire, it takes an ignition, and you get a severe fire. Here in Lane County, we still have a window, and it's about 2 to 3 weeks a year where we spend in high to extreme fire danger. And so far, we've gotten lucky in that we've caught fires that have started on those days. Right? So we catch about 95% of the fires that are out there on the landscape, which is pretty good. So the question is, when is the remaining 5% that we don't catch line up with extreme fire behavior like this? And that's when you have catastrophic events like Paradise. And we spend about a week or 2 each year in those types of conditions. But only 2 weeks, that's not months, we're better than California. So I think now would be a good time to just take questions about fire science stuff, and then we'll get into defensible space. I think, yep.
So of the 65-mile-an-hour wind, how much of that was fire creating and how much was regular ambient wind?
So his question was, of the 65-mile-an-hour wind that we had in Paradise, how much was generated by the fire and how much was just regular wind patterns? In the Paradise fire, they had, I forget if it was Santa Ana winds, but it was a climate-driven wind event. When you do have when you have large fires, they do create their own weather patterns. I think 65 mile an hour in that area was more than enough to just drive that fire where that wind was going. It's a great question. All right, so his question was, we were talking about embers, those wind-blown embers. What else would we call them? Firebrands, I guess? I don't know. Okay. So his question was, do fire embers, are they the same from an oak forest and a conifer? And it's an excellent question, because they're not at all. So have you guys had a lot of embers when how long do oak leaf embers last when you put them on a campfire? I mean, they're basically out by the time they get in the air, right? The embers that travel long distances need to be much larger. So you do get when you get larger embers from conifer forests, when you have fine fuel, you really don't get any embers at all, which is why it's a much, I don't want to say safer, but it's a much more manageable fire to have on the landscape because you don't have to worry about it jumping, a quarter mile away. Great question. Yep.
Maybe you're going to touch on this in defensible space. So just wait. But this was quite an event that we had, the snowstorm. In my forest of 19 acres, had a tremendous amount of damage. Tops broken off. The whole trees that came down either broke or a lot of them uprooted because of the moisture. So it seems like there's a huge amount of fuel on the ground right now. And it would be prime summer. My strategy has been to get it as close to the ground as possible. I don't remove anything. I just go through the forest and cut it and get it close to the ground. So either comment now or if you're going to comment on it later, that'd be good.
So his question was about the recent snowstorm that we had and all the excess fuel that came from that, snowstorm event, and maybe what do you do with all that fuel? And so what he said was actually it's a good place to start if you can't actually treat the fuel, which would be burning it or chipping it. But if you can't do that, he laid it on the ground. So what do you think laying a piece of wood on the ground does instead of having it stand up? To the moisture? It's going to hold more moisture if it's on the ground because it's going to have less air contact and it's being closer to that moisture source, which is the ground. So it's a good thing to do, which is to lay it down. The other thing that you're doing is you're removing the ladder fuel. So if you have a 10-foot stick standing up, technically you could have a 10-foot flame length on that stick. If you lay it down, you only have the flame length as high as it's off the ground. Does that make sense? Great question. How are we doing on time? Yeah. Yeah, so I believe the question, correct me if I'm wrong, is the reason conifers burn due to the sap and the resinous compounds that are in them? That's definitely part of it. But let me just jump all the way here. 6:25, so we got about half hour left. Okay, great. All right, we're doing great on time. All right, so the resinous compounds in conifers definitely lend to more active fire behavior. It's kind of like gasoline that they hold in small amounts. But the other issue with conifers is the arrangement of fuel and the type, right? So a conifer is actually, it's the shape that you are taught to build a campfire when you're, right, a teepee. The other thing is the needles, you have thousands of small needles with a large surface area and relatively small volume. So those needles dry out a lot quicker than an oak leaf that has much more volume but less relative surface area. Does that make sense? Have you guys ever thrown a green conifer branch on a fire? Yeah. It doesn't take long for that thing to go up, but individual needles burning in close proximity to each other really lends to that active fire behavior. Good question. So I think moving into defensible space. All right, how we doing here? Do we need to do a beer run first? Do we have a question? Okay.
So you said that you catch the fires before they start. Like, how are you catching them? Are you proactively out there, or?
So her question was, how do you catch the fire? And it's not with a hat, and it's usually pretty carefully. No, when we catch the fire, we use this. It's a strategy called anchor and flank. And so when we catch a fire, basically what that means is we've completely encircled the fire and prevented its spread. And the way that we do that is we start at the point of origin and we work on usually the less active flank. So if the wind is blowing northeast, we would start on the southwest corner of that fire and we slowly wrap around it with a truck and water or a hose lay if it's in the middle of the woods and we can't get a truck to it. So starting at the point of origin and just wrapping around, usually with water, is how we catch those guys. And so under 10 acres would be considered a catch where it's not going into extended attack. And so 95% of the fires that we catch on the landscape are less than 10 acres before they get large.
Is that because someone called it in and said there's a fire, or because you?
Yeah, magically, divine that they're, no. So the question was, is that because someone called it in? And that is virtually every time, that's how we get notified of a fire in the area. And eyes out there, even for burn piles that are happening in a high fire danger, are really useful for us. So we have about 12 engines that cover 750,000 square miles, right? So, I mean, we're basically staging in certain areas of our district, and then we wait to get a call to a fire, and the closest engine is the one that responds. And so if you ever do see something like a forest fire or anything that you think could be an issue, usually the way it works, you just call 911 and they'll dispatch to us. But so yeah, definitely if you see something, say something, because an hour or half an hour until someone calls it in can make a big difference. All right. Yeah, one more question. Yeah.
Our current president,
Hey.
he's a stable genius, has recommended that we rake our forest. I'm wondering what kind of rake do you suggest?
Yeah, big one. Yeah. That I saw that and that killed me because he talked to somebody that knew what they were talking about, but he didn't quite connect. Yeah. No, really, active forest management, really, you can manipulate a lot about how fire works in a forest based on manipulating the fuel. That's really the only thing that we can actively manage.
Also, all these trees that fell from the storm, and then you cut up the tree, and then you have all the loose limbs that are down.
Yeah.
You got to get rid of those.
So the question was, all the loose limbs that came down from this storm damage, you have to get rid of them? Sometimes, but we're going to get into that right now. You don't have to get rid of all the fuel, right? Yeah, one more. Okay, that's it then. We're cutting it off, yeah. Great question. So the question was, what percentage in Lane County do we have oak versus fir forests? Historically, oaks dominated the Willamette Valley, but as you go into the Coast Range and the Cascades, that was all conifer. Yep. So in the mountainous regions, the higher up in elevation you got, definitely historically all conifer. But in the Willamette Valley, we had much more oak and prairie, and most of that is now in agriculture or conifer forests. Okay, so when you are beginning to manipulate or getting concerned about fire and you're trying to do proactive steps, just remember, fire it's pretty predictable, right? So it needs fuel. The fuel needs to dry out and be ready to combust before it can add to that fire. And the fire energy increases with the amount of accessible fuel, meaning fuel that's dried out, ready to combust. So the more fuel that you have out there, the larger fire you could have, right? The solution, and what we're going to be talking about for the second half of this, is mimicking low-intensity surface fires. If a surface fire comes through every 7 years, imagine how much fuel that gets rid of. And we haven't touched our forests in nearly 100 years. So a little bit of active management each year is going to go a long way in reducing fire behavior around your home or in your forest or whatever area it is you're trying to predict. So this is just, this is an example of what defensible space could do, and this is a spectrum. So on the left here, you've got a very manicured, probably Southern California lots, and then on the right there, that house was right in the middle of looks like a pine forest, but still survived, right? So it definitely works, and there's plenty of science to back it up, but we're just going to get into what you guys can do. There's 3 zones. The closer you are to your house, the more important it is, right? So zone 1, that red line within 30 feet, that's critical. What we don't want to have is a fire that starts from 3,000 feet away and gets all the way up to 2 feet from your house before it's run out of fuel. The idea is to remove fuel within a certain proximity of your home so the fire just stops there, because if you don't put more logs on the fire, it goes out, right? Okay, so this is what I see when I'm out assessing defensible space. All right, here's your firewood example. Tinder, you've got your nice decorative grasses. Kindling, you've got your nice conifer, tree, your spruce tree. And then the firewood is your house. So, the goal is to build the world's worst campfire around your house. Within 150 feet, that's your fire pit ring. What you put in there and how you arrange it is going to determine if you have a safe house in the event of a wildfire or a not so safe house. All right, so we're just going to run through some examples really quick. All right, now that you guys are fire experts, you guys should be able to give me some answers. So why is the left one not so nice? I heard right up next to the house. Yep. So we've got a large accumulation of fuel, vegetation, right up next to the house. The first, he's got a nice grass patch in there, but the issue is those embers, right? So virtually every house that's lost from a wildfire event is lost because an ember lands in combustible material next to the house and starts a spot fire right in the place where you don't want it. So shoring up the perimeter of your house is really the single largest thing you guys can do to protect your houses in the event a wildfire moves through the area. All right, and what about the right one? Why do we have a question mark there? Because of those firs. Nailed it. Yep, so she's talking about the firs on the left side of that property. Do you guys see how there's, it looks like we've got really good defensible space in the front, but it actually, the fuel wraps around and gets nice and close to that house. You guys see that? Okay, so the general rule of thumb is whatever is burning is going to put off up to time and a half a flame length, right? So if you have a 1 foot bush, you could have 1.5 foot flame. Does that make sense? All right, so when you're walking around your property and wondering, is this enough space, just remember that time and a half rule. And if you have time and a half of whatever you're looking at spacing out in between it and the next piece of fuel, chances are it's probably enough space. Does that make sense? Both. Absolutely. It depends on wind, right? So if we have a 60-mile-an-hour wind, that's going to be horizontal. All right. All right, so you guys nailed that, zone 1. Zone 2, why do we have a question mark on the left one? Nope. Oh, the house is a ways there. So we're in zone 2 now, which is between 30 and 75 feet. So zone 1 looks great, but in terms of zone 2, I'm looking at that island. Why do I have a question mark next to that island on the left side? Ladder fuels. Yep. So this island's placement is less than ideal. It's put right next to a conifer that has its branch coming within 5 feet of the ground. So you've got a lot of fine fuel next to a conifer, a low-hanging conifer branch, right? So just some things to keep in mind. There's 2 things you could do here. You could move the island, or you could limb up the conifer branch. Problem solved. What if that's a rain garden? Well, it's going to hold more moisture. No. If it's a rain garden, it's probably going to be less susceptible to an ember landing in it. So that's, if an area has enough moisture in it, it will put an ember out. I personally I'd limb up that branch and I wouldn't have to worry about it. That's how I would deal with that one. The right one is really nice for 2 reasons. All right, we're looking at oaks, I love oaks. And 2, they've done native understory plantings underneath those oak trees. So what you're going to find is a lot of the native species that are fire adapted, meaning they don't readily combust, are paired with oak prairie systems because they burned once every 7 to 15 years. So the plants that lived in those areas had to withstand burning or be able to resprout in the event of a fire did come through. Does that make sense? All right, so using native fire-resistant plants is another really good tool, and doing that in zone 2. Fire-resistant plants. And actually, I've got a whole book of plants over there. It's online from OSU Extension, but as you guys leave, if you want to grab a book of some Firewise plants, we've got them. So, all right, okay. So, before I ask this question, do we have any foresters in the crowd? Oh, we got a forester, nice, all right. Any natural resource conservation, Coast Fork excluded? All right, we got another one back there. Oh, we got 2, all right. Okay, so you guys may know the answer to this question, but, general public, on the left, everyone here is going to know that. Why is that not so nice? A lot of down wood. I see a lot of fuel in that left picture. All right. Why is there a question mark on the right side? And we're talking about our forests here, not on the east side. Does that look like our forests? There's not enough trees, right? On the western side of the Cascades, we have a closed canopy. What you're seeing in the right picture is not a closed canopy. That looks more like an eastern forest. So like if you go out to Bend, have you guys ever been out to Bend and you've seen those pines that are growing 20, 40 feet apart? The reason they're growing that far apart there is they're not light limited, they're water limited. So they can only grow so close to each other without drying up. We don't have those types of forests here. We have a closed canopy forest, and a closed canopy is really good for a number of reasons. It keeps up the relative humidity, so you have more energy working against a fire in the event it gets established. It reduces light from penetrating, so it'll prevent things from drying out as well. And a live green canopy actually will catch a lot of those embers that are flying through the air. Have you ever seen an ember land on a green piece of vegetation and just poof, that thing goes up? It doesn't happen too often, right? It'd have to be a pretty dry piece of, maybe a piece of grass, or mulch. If you got one in there, it could kind of skunk around. But if you have a green, healthy plant, it's going to have enough moisture in its leaves to catch an ember and put it out before it hits the ground. So that's good news. So don't make your forest, if you have a conifer forest, don't make it look like the right, all right? If I were you and if I didn't know that much about forest management, I would start with the dying and dead trees that were acting as ladder fuels. So on the left here, you can see a couple red trees in the understory. I'd start with those. And then I'd also start with taking out some ladder fuels that were leaning, that were acting as a ladder from the ground to the canopy. And after that, I really wouldn't worry about zone 3 that much, because it's really what's within 30 feet of your house that matters most. It's okay the average canopy fire can roll through an area in 60 seconds. The average house can take up to 10 minutes to combust from a canopy, from that radiant heat. So if you can prevent the canopy fire from touching your house, you're not going to lose it from a canopy fire. Does that make sense? Okay, so here are the take-homes. Embers ignite homes. Keep your tree canopy. And your spring cleaning, that 0 to 5 foot perimeter around your house is the most critical. Leaves and embers. Embers in leaves in gutters are how homes are lost. Leaves in the corner nook of eaves and places where leaves collect, that's where embers are going to collect as well. So if you have your tinder, which is the dried out leaves or needles, right next to some bark mulch or a deck, which would be your kindling, that's how you're starting to build a good campfire, right? You've got your tinder and your kindling all underneath your log, which is the house. So separate that fine fuel, take that out of 30 feet of your house, and you're gonna be vastly improved, with the exception of, worst case scenario, in which case, we're gonna be doing everything we can to stop that, so. Okay, and then when you are treating vegetation, do your best to take out invasives. If you want to clean up the understory of a forest, take out invasives like Scotch broom and blackberries. All right, so the general rule of thumb for flame length was 1.5 times. All right, Scotch broom, 3 times. Right? So Scotch broom, if you have a 1 foot Scotch broom, you could have a 3 foot flame length off that. So those invasive species, that's really low hanging fruit to take out. And when you take them out, replant it with something native, because this is Western Oregon, something's going to grow there, right? So, okay. All right. Yep, questions? That's it. Between a creek and a house? Oh, that's a trick question. Her question was, what's the distance that needs to be cleared from the creek to the house? I'm going to get in hot water either way here. So, do you have a 5 foot perimeter on your house? Great. Is it 100% clean? No. Start with that. All right, we never. Very true. Yep. So if you're next to a creek, generally you're going to have a higher moisture content. I would be more concerned with the fine fuels because those, they dry out quicker, and I'd be less concerned with trees and stuff like that. If you have conifers, I suggest limbing up those tree limbs at least 8 feet away from your house and from the ground within 30 feet, because that'll help keep that fire on the ground and not go up. All right. Yep. Yes.
Will a house that's combust through, so I have a perimeter that's pretty clear, but my house has metal roof and it has, well, hardy plank, but it has the fiber cement siding. My question is, will a house combust through that if the heat gets rough? Does that happen?
So his question, correct me if I'm wrong, but your question was if you have hardy plank, which is a really fire-resistant material, will your house combust through that? For example, your plywood? Yep. So I don't know the specifications of hardy plank, but even a general vinyl siding, it's going to take at least 10 minutes for direct flame contact on that to combust the material behind it. Hardy plank, I know, is much better. So if you have hardy plank, they've done some pretty good studies with hardy plank. That stuff will melt before it burns. Yeah. 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 So his question was, what about asphalt shingles? And the issue with asphalt shingles, the shingles themselves are virtually, like, you're never going to have an ember start those on fire. Same thing's going to happen. They're going to melt before they actually combust, right? So you don't have to worry about the individual shingles. What you do have to worry about on asphalt and virtually any roof is the fine material that's on top of that roof, right? So if you have 2 inches of needles in the corner of your asphalt roof, that will combust a house. The other thing to really pay attention to is what's directly underneath that asphalt shingle. It's plywood, right? And where is that plywood most exposed? Right where that gutter meets that roof. So leaves in your gutters, that's where you've got tinder touching kindling. That's the highest risk area. But the asphalt roof itself, no problem. Yeah.
I might have missed something because I came in late, but have you seen any research around how fire behaves and moves through a forest with more like deciduous trees in the canopy? I've heard
Yeah.
that those can pull out some of the energy of the fire because of their higher moisture.
So his question was, and I think we kind of answered this, but it was about deciduous forests, and so oaks are deciduous forests. And the question was, do deciduous forests change fire behavior in that they combat it with a higher moisture content?
But also more specifically, like forests that are mixed conifer deciduous.
Okay, so mixed conifer hardwood. Yep. That's a great question. I think, don't quote me on this, but I would bet that that's more of a function of the relative moisture that those plants are indicating of that area more than the individual leaves. So, I mean, deciduous vegetation is definitely a fine fuel, and that will carry fire just as easily as a dry grass will. But I would bet maples, alders, usually growing in moisture conditions, and those trees are going to have more relative moisture that they're pumping through via transpiration than a conifer would. Yep. Yes?
Management during fire is a single-purpose management of woods. Can you comment on the ecological impact both locally around residences and more general around the forest as a result of managing as you're suggesting?
So let me make sure I got this right. Ecological considerations based on our historic management for a single purpose, which has been fire suppression.
No, if you're recommending treating the forest for
Oh, yeah.
prevention and treating around residences, that might
Sure.
change the ecology, plant and animal ecology in and around those places that live in these forests. And I wonder if you could comment on what you would expect that impact to be.
Sure. So the question I think now, I think I have it, is what would be the ecological impact of doing a solely fuel reduction approach to going into a forest and changing that structure? That's an excellent. Does everyone did I say that all right? Okay, I'll say it one more time. So, what are the ecological implications of only treating for hazardous fuel? Right? Okay. So, two things. If we're in an oak and prairie system or an open oak woodland that has not seen a surface fire in a number of years, and you start mimicking a surface fire, with enough active management, it could be a beneficial thing, right? So we have about 95% of our oak and prairie systems are not there anymore, right? So if we could conserve an oak forest by reducing the conifer canopy of encroaching conifers, theoretically, that would be a healthy thing. When we get into forest management, really zone 3 is forest restoration. And forest restoration is best left to people who know how to properly restore a forest. So I would say any forest disturbance has a potential to be good or bad. It depends on how well informed that disturbance is. But in general, hazardous fuel reduction in fire-prone landscapes is mimicking a natural disturbance that we've removed from that system. So for example, invasive species are not real fire. The two major invasive species that we have, blackberries and Scotch broom, not fire resistant at all, right? And removing those invasive species and replanting with a native understory species, probably net benefit. But if you go in there and you start nicking up other stuff, it really depends on how it's done. If you guys are homeowners and you don't want to invest in having, if you guys are concerned about ecology, which I think we all should be, finding a specialist that is, to come out and assess how they may do that would be a good idea. And I would really be focusing on zone 1 and 2, right? Zone 3 is pretty low impact in terms of what a fire is going to do to the home. And until you have zone 1 completely shored up, I wouldn't be going to zone 2. And the same goes for 2 to 3. So zone 2 is from 30 feet to 75 feet. So 30 feet is a relatively small home footprint, and until that is 100% dialed, meaning all the fine fuel has been treated, you have green grass less than 4 inches, you've removed conifer branches that are low hanging, you could stop at 30 feet if you had a well defensible space there. Yeah. So the question was, how far should a conifer be from the house? The limb should be at least 8 feet. And if you have a conifer overstory that you can prune that tree up above the house 8 to 15 feet, I would leave that tree from a fire perspective.
So 8 feet from the house.
Yep.
And then 18 feet up.
8 feet from the house away and 8 feet up off the ground. And if you have a tree that is high enough that it's over your house, 15 feet above the house. Okay. You had a question? So the question was, what about landscaping around the house that's regularly watered? If we're looking at this picture here, I would still, I would suggest that you put that amount of fuel further away from your house. But the more moisture that something has, the more it's going to resist a fire coming through the area. So if you have a very moist landscaped area, the chances of an ember starting are not going to be that high, unless, which happens often, is a fire comes through the area or some event comes through the area, knocks out the power, it's not getting watered. If it's fine fuel, it's going to dry out relatively quickly. Yeah.
What do you do when the firewood is next door to you, meaning your neighbor's house?
What do you do when the fire's next door?
Our things go so close together now.
Yeah.
One goes up, the next one's going up too.
So the question was, what do you do when that fire is so close to your, when your neighbor's house is within 30 feet of your own or within 150 feet of your own? And that's really where community planning takes place, So I would say I might be a little more careful about what I planted within that 30-foot zone, knowing that I had another house, specifically what's between those two houses, But fire-wise communities are communities where basically people are just aware of the fire risk and they're collectively reducing it. And I would suggest getting organized as a community would be the best step. And then long-term planning, this is something that we've known for a while. Minimum setbacks to prevent this type of stuff in a fire environment is it's pretty good. If you have a subdivision, designing a green space on the outside of it instead of in between, really fire safe principle. So just getting those things incorporated into policy would be the next step. Yeah. Oh man, I love that question. So he asked, what about cedar siding or cedar fencing? All right, what do you guys think? Cedar fencing, what is that kindling? Yes. That's the best kindling there is, man. Yeah. So cedar fencing, I've seen videos where a fire will move along a cedar fence and just continue around that cedar fence until it gets to wherever that cedar fence stops, which is quite often the home. So if you have a cedar fence, I would suggest preferably 30 feet away. If it can't be 30 feet away, I would suggest not connecting it to your house with cedar. I'd go with like a hardy plank or something that won't combust right up next to your house. Are we doing good on time? Okay. 8 minutes till 7. I've got people up high that I'm totally missing. Oh my God, I'm sorry. Yes. Okay, how high do I recommend limbing conifers? I missed that first part. Oh, in zone 3. Oh, excellent question. So, zone 3 is outside, that's 75 to 150 feet away. I'm not sure you would really have to limb conifers. I'd be more concerned about the density of stems. Right, so there we're doing forest health improvements, and maybe we could do some self-thinning type prescriptions where we're releasing trees that are otherwise crowded. And in zone 2, 8 feet. Yep, or at least remember whatever is growing underneath it. So if you have a 3-foot tall grass, 8 feet's probably not going to be enough. So 8 feet above the surface vegetation would be good. Yeah. Oh man, another policy question. His questions do I feel that the backyard burning or debris pile burning regulations, are they adequate? Man, I was hoping not to say this, but no comment. I honestly don't know enough about it to really put it on. I will say that we have regulations on when we allow burning, like slash piles from logging operations, so ODF will do that. And we're pretty good about requiring people to check in every day before they're planning on burning and closing the burning window if we're outside of, a safe time to burn. So I think we actually closed slash burning over a month ago now because we had those 3 weeks in April that were just so dry. We had east winds, which have 0% humidity, so it dried stuff out quick. All right. Yep. All right, so the question was, what do you do with the chips when you chip material? Chipping material it's a pretty effective way to treat that fuel rapidly, right? So you chip it, and the question was, do you have to haul it off, or what do you do with it? I would not put it within 5 feet of my house, so the perimeter of bark mulch, I may look at converting that to stone or something non-combustible. But, bark in your flower beds, no problem. You could absolutely leave it in the woods, yeah. So the thing about bark mulch, not that much oxygen, right? So anytime you see fire and you throw on bark chips, you get smoldering, you get a whole bunch of smoke. There's just not enough oxygen to really make that fuel become an issue. It can hold heat for a long time, but chip it back in the woods. We do it all the time. Yep. Okay. Yeah. So your question was, do we have grant programs like you saw, or just a program for someone to come out and assess your defensible space? The only program that we have is I mean, yes, we have those programs, but they are grant funded. So virtually all of our prevention dollars in the entire county is soft funded, meaning it's only through grant funds that we're doing this work. So the grant funds limit us in a number of ways. Primarily, they limit us to a certain geographic region. And we have 3 active grants right now in Lane County, but the last one in Cottage Grove was 2 years ago, but I did just write one for this next cycle. So currently there's none in the Cottage Grove area, but we are working on doing that. Yes?
Wanted to touch on Firewise community, because I live up on Bulletin Ranch Road, and
Oh,
you
yeah.
guys came up and you shipped for us. Just want to kind of talk about that, or?
Sure. Yeah. So Firewise, his question was, what about, what's going on with these Firewise communities? And that's actually, so Firewise communities are a collection of community members, 8 homes or more, that are in a geographic area that makes sense. So if you're on a one-way in road and you've got 15 houses, that would make sense, right? So Firewise communities are a way for us to kind of pre-identify active, engaged communities. And for Firewise communities, that service is provided for the whole county. Really low minimum investment, so they require that you have minimum 8 households. You invest 1 hour of fuel reduction activities per household per year. I bet you guys are on hour 50 this year for one house, maybe 200, I don't know. So, and then you hold an education event, and right now, check that off the box, we're doing it right now. So it's pretty easy to become a Firewise community. And your next step, if you were looking at doing that, would just be contacting myself and setting up a assessment for the community. Do you have to get along with your neighbors? It helps, but no, you don't have to. All right. I think. All right. Okay. I think. Are we on the last question? I think we're on the last question. All right. Yep.
In your experience, is a mixed age forest less likely to have a canopy fire than a single age forest?
So his question was, is a mixed age forest safer than a single age forest? And one way to tell if you have a mixed age forest is generally you have different levels of canopy, right? So a single age forest would be like a plantation where you basically just have one canopy layer. I don't have enough experience with that to say for sure, but I will say 2 things. One, a mixed age forest is going to hold more moisture, right? So you're going to have more moisture in that system than you would a single age forest. The other thing I'll say is if it's an actively managed forest and they've reduced the ladder fuels, then that may be safer from a canopy fire on its own. But forests generally don't stand on their own. So, okay, well, I think that's all we had time for, so I'm going to